Thank you very much for joining us tonight. This is the opening panel of the conference Cultures in Rejection, which we organize in the framework of the project Cultures of Rejection in Europe, partnered between 5 universities coming from Sweden, Germany, Austria, Croatia, and Serbia. Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory is local partner from Serbia. This is something which started in 2018, and it's, as you can see, 4 years. In these 4 years, we had a lot of challenges, and somehow we moved from an initial idea to explore how what is the connection between migration flow, which we had in years before that. What is the connection between that flow and the rise of right wing? How this rise and how this construction of the other, or how we name it, cultures of rejection, are actually shown, embedded in norms and practices of everyday life. There were several things which we had in mind back then. We focused on 2 sectors of the trade and logistics, and try to explore how workers in these sectors perceive cultures of rejection. But then COVID struck, as you all know, and then everything changed. We couldn't access people. The whole situation, social situation, changed, and some other rejections emerged through this process. And then COVID maybe ended, we don't know, but we behave certainly as it did. Then we saw that actually that some other processes are going on, which are going in parallel, and maybe they are linked to this, what we started to research, maybe they are not. We are going to discuss in next 2 days, starting off this evening, how they are connected. But in general, we see that there is a strong rise of right wing. There is this is something which we actually wanted to tackle this evening. We have a short film, well, short half an hour film, that is product of this project, and that is thematizing issues which we faced through this project. And I'm going to invite you here to take a look, and then I'm going to invite our panelists for this evening and introduce them, and we are going to start discussion. We're going to try to be brief. Our plan is to have maximum 45 minutes, and then the summer is really, sun is really shining, and it's difficult to focus in this hot temperature, so we are going to try to be brief, but also very much informative for you. And I hope that we are going to see you in next 2 days also in very interesting session which we are going to have. So, please.
Hello, I'm Makosi Khabi. In recent years, we have witnessed the normalization of authoritarian, racist, and anti-migrant political stances across Europe. Some of what used to be the selling points of far-right movements and parties has become part of the mainstream in several regions of the world in their politics and the media. At the same time, the pandemic has gifted far-right movements and parties with a fresh wind. They've since presented themselves as opponents of the state and international measures to combat COVID. In light of these disturbing trends, scholars across Europe in the fields of sociology, psychology, philosophy, political science, and cultural studies came together in a research project called Cultures of Rejection, or CURE for short. CURE consists of 5 research teams from Sweden, Germany, Austria, Croatia, and Serbia. Here's Manuela Boyagiev, project leader and professor at the Institute of European Ethnology in the Humboldt University, Berlin.
Authoritarian politics, far-right parties, right-wing populism, and racism have become acceptable and even desirable for certain sections of society. Our goal is to better understand this social and cultural climate. We call this climate cultures of rejection. It emerges as the result of multiple crises in Europe's democracies, due to changes in national settings and institutions and in civil society. It is the aim of our project to study the conditions that have led to a variety of rejections. Among them, we will find migration, political elites, broadcast media, and cultural values such as gender equality and sexual liberty.
The project assumes that transformation in work environments constitute a key part to the present political dynamics. Technological changes, changing market demands, deteriorating work conditions, or de-skilling are taking place in the retail and logistics sectors. First, the researchers spoke to workers in these sectors about their experiences and listened to their stories. Cultures of rejection are, however, not only present in the workplace environments. They're also present in spaces where people recuperate and take part in cultural life. Spaces in which they carry out necessary chores like shopping, cleaning, and raising of children. Spaces in which they meet and try and make sense of the world that surrounds them. Supermarket checkout lines, gym locker rooms, public Facebook pages, WhatsApp groups, or the counter of the pub downstairs. These spaces of everyday social life shape perceptions about transformation and crisis. This is Alexander Harder, a researcher in Germany.
Through mappings of workers' everyday lives, we have identified the digital and the socio-spatial environments relevant to their daily routines. We researched how they contribute to cultures of rejection ethnographically. This means we drew not only on document analyses and expert interviews, but engaged in continuous observation and participation. We are concerned with authoritarianism's culture, and we are devoted to diagnosing the societal conditions under which it erupts, spreads, and thrives. So we ask, how can we foster countercultural conditions that challenge authoritarian politics?
Now we'll take a look at the project's first findings. A key aspect of cultures of rejection is the migration movements of 2015 and the stories that are told about them. It's a story that we all know, a story that we've all heard. It's an old story about foreigners, strangers, and others. It's a story about borders and limits and what happens when they're not respected. The story goes something like this. There's only so much of the other, so much strangeness that a society can bear. If there's too much of it and too many of them, then we must expect a social reaction. It's a story that we've heard time and time again. In the summer of 2015, once again, people fled from poverty and war. They decided to journey to countries such as Sweden, Austria, Germany, Serbia, and Croatia. Most often, they were met and supported in very practical and symbolic ways. In Germany, a new terminology emerged, the Willkommenskultur, a welcoming culture. Sure, this term was quickly adopted by politicians wanting to polish their image in the world. But at the same time, it seemed to capture a mood that seemed to emerge that summer. A mood that emerged from small, tiny acts of solidarity. But then the story continues. The climate changed. A wave of attacks followed on migrants and refugees as the summer faded. In order to justify these attacks, a new terminology emerged: the refugee crisis. Far-right political parties and movements profited from that story. What caused this shift? Although many commentators in politics and media were appalled by these developments, at the same time it was portrayed as an inevitable outcome of too much otherness, too many strangers. Isn't this, they speculated, an inevitable, if unpleasant reflex, a mechanism of self-defense for society to react to the refugee crisis? Benjamin Opratko is a Cure research team member in Vienna, questioning this story.
The story we just heard is in fact a familiar one. The French philosopher Etienne Balibar coined a term for it. He called it meta-racism. It's a racist way of explaining racism. Meta-racism is a racism that claims to have learned its lesson. It's a racism that reacts to the challenge of anti-racism. It asks us to understand racist violence, to accept authoritarian politics as something like a feverish immune reaction of society. The body politic, it claims, protects itself against potentially harmful intruders. It suggests that in the end, the best way to prevent racist violence is to limit the influx of potentially harmful, strange others.
The story is familiar, and we've heard many variations of it, but none of them hold up when we look more closely. It is clear that there is no correlation between the presence of migrants and the political success of the far right.
Racism is not a natural reaction. Racism creates meaning. It orders our experiences. It makes sense of often baffling contradictions. Racism is a venue for comforting social conflicts by exerting violence, by excluding people from communities, sometimes even from humanity as a whole. Its roots are not found inside the minds of individuals, even though they can become obsessed with it. Racism lies in the very material structures of how we live, how we operate in society. Therefore, to combat racism, we have to understand how figures of the migrant or the refugee or the Muslim emerge, how they become meaningful for the way people look at their own lives, how they interpret their own worlds. So what are the conditions? What are the conditions in which people live, work, communicate with each other that leads them to embrace not a culture of welcoming, but a culture of rejection?
In some cases, cultures of rejection emerge from experiences in changing work environments. Let's look at the example of the Croatian seafarers to better understand the relationship between labor and rejection. This is Rijeka, the biggest port on the Croatian Adriatic Sea in the Kvarner Bay. It has become one of the central logistic hubs of global capitalism. Traditionally multicultural and multi-ethnic, with an extraordinarily rich multi-layered history, several times in the past divided, and still unique and united. This city is now exposed to the same malice of all former industrial sites. Swift change of its working landscape. Working conditions on container ships have changed drastically over the last years and decades. Tighter security measures, which are often introduced in the name of anti-terrorism, coincided with the emergence of automatization. Marko Luka-Župčić, a researcher with the Croatian Cure team, describes what that means for seafarers' daily lives.
For seafarers, it has become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to leave the ship while in port. What had been a defining feature of a seafarer's life, the encounter with different people, cultures, and places, became increasingly brief, surveilled, and managed. Once the agent of multiculturalism, bringing home the experiences and traces of their global journey, seafarers now mostly spend their ever-decreasing free time on board and online. As one of our interlocutors noted, while the museums of seafarers of 20th century abound in artifacts and stories which brought the world into the homes of their families and friends, the museums of the seafarers of 21st century would be almost empty.
The researchers also found that weak trade unions contributed to the conditions under which cultures of rejection emerged.
A person working on a large ship told us bitterly, our union is known as very bad. They don't care. But for example, the Philippine union is very strong. If their working hours are not respected, the union reacts immediately. I never experienced that. Once one ship from our company was stopped in Australia, salaries were not paid. Filipinos reported their problem and their salaries were paid quickly, but we waited much longer. This is unimaginable in Croatia, and people are unsatisfied and full of resentment.
Indeed, often those most prone to rejection are those who are themselves rejected. Left at the mercy of hollowed-out institutions and international capitalist regimes in the midst of multiple global crises, without the support of a union, without an organized collective voice, without the power and influence of a strong community. In this insight, perhaps lies the beginning of working out how to change the key conditions that give rise to cultures of rejection. At the same time, we should not give in to stereotypes of dissatisfied and disappointed workers. They do not automatically react to experiences of crisis and transformation by rejecting authorities and migrants. Cultures of rejection are always mediated by ideologies and myths, by racism and sexism, but also in very material ways in which we act and communicate. Conflicts and grievances are not only discussed on the ships and docks, they're also discussed online, on social media. Their emotions can become distorted. In some cases, anonymity can encourage some to express extreme opinions. The open-ended nature of social situations online can aggravate this dynamic. Long streams of extreme speech can constantly pull users back into an increasingly negative emotional spiral. Cultures of rejection aims to understand the conditions that encourage devaluation and debasement of others and the de-democratizing attitudes. An important factor in this regard are the physical and digital spaces in which social relationships take place today. So, let us look at how spaces of everyday lives, in our homes, in places where we socialize, and digital spaces facilitate cultures of rejection. Let's imagine a map of the spaces that everyday life traverses today. For the German workers that the researchers interviewed, this is roughly what it would look like. Daily routines are perceived as happening mainly between the workplace and their home and their neighborhoods. Conversations with colleagues at the workplace in break rooms, smokers' lounges, or group chats served as the main sites for interaction, from coordinating shifts to venting about their work. Outside the workplace, however, spaces of collective sense-making are sparse. Inconvenient working hours in retail leave only little time and energy for civic engagement or cultural activities beyond the necessary daily chores. For others, a desire for flexibility and self-determination led to undertaking those leisure activities that they found time for alone.
Digital environments form an exception, of course. Online, it is easier to interact and talk with others. But rather than delving headfirst into an ocean of personally tailored social media content, workers were much more skeptical. The publicity of social media platforms and an exhaustion with the pace of current events has made many wary of online environments and of news reporting in general. The half-private channels of messengers such as WhatsApp and Telegram appear much more relevant than the network publics of Facebook, Twitter, etc. Not necessarily because they are less frantic, but because they are perceived as unburdened by politics.
In addition to group chats and private messenger services, another more traditional space is key to the everyday interpretation of experiences, grievances, or current events. One's own private home. At dinner with the family or on the couch with the spouse, people feel secure and protected to actually speak their minds. Looking out from within, society appears threatening. Anxieties about censorship, the feeling that you cannot talk to the people anymore, or a general atmosphere of hostility justify the workers' retreat into these more private circles. In what appears as a beleaguered position, the researchers encounter elements of a walled subjectivity, closing itself off to the outside world, protecting what is seen as ours, and forfeiting the desire to change or impact society in meaningful ways. Scarce resources in terms of time and in terms of emotional capacities justify this decision. The challenge, it seems, would be to create space for different, porous, and open ways of relating to one, to grow and thrive. Cultures of rejection diminish trust in democratic and political institutions. The case of Serbia illustrates how this dynamic can amount to a widespread disillusionment or a rejection of politics as such, a phenomenon sometimes called anti-politics. Cure researchers in Serbia found sweeping rage and dissatisfaction amongst the people they interviewed and the movements that they observed. These sentiments are expressed as primarily a rejection of politics. Politicians and the political establishment are seen as a malevolent force directly infringing on citizens' personal lives. A deep dissatisfaction with the social conditions in the country sustains this perception. Under these conditions, a vicious circle of social isolation and political alienation emerges. This became apparent to CURE researchers when they observed the 2020 protests against the ruling party's handling of the pandemic. This is Sarah Nikolic, CURE team member at the University of Belgrade.
In Serbia, we have found two types of rejection. The first type refers to a negative orientation towards politicians themselves, while the second is directed towards political institutions and the political process in general. What we find here is what French philosopher Jacques Rancière calls anti-politics. He views it as a consequence of estrangement from the public sphere that causes a disavowal of politics and democracy among citizens. The rejection of political elites constructs them as corrupt and as doing politics for their selfish interest only. In anti-politics, the political system itself is perceived as an entity that is beyond citizens' control completely. They believe that their participation cannot meaningfully influence the political outcomes, and they feel impotent to induce the change they need. Paradoxically, for politicians, anti-politics can become a way of doing politics. Take this statement by Aleksandar Vučić, president of Serbia, as an example.
Kad god vidim da se političari umešaju, a to je u slučaju Dragana Markovića, utroba mi se okrene naopačke, jer ti političari su lagali za milion drugih stvari i ništa im ne verujem.
In this case, we find authoritarian politicians mobilizing cultures of rejection in order to hollow out democratic processes and institutions.
In 2020, a global pandemic shifted political landscapes in many of the countries researched by the project. Cultures of rejection have undoubtedly played its part during the COVID-19 crisis. The opposition to anti-pandemic measures often drew on conspiracy myths and spiritualism, while often finding themselves caught in a noxious relationship with established media. When the pandemic hit Sweden, public perception of the government was already damaged by several government crises beginning in 2014. Under pressure from the populist right, the last Swedish elections in 2018 resulted in an unstable ruling coalition and fueled skepticism about its ability to enact meaningful policies. It was within this political context that Sweden experienced the pandemic. The first government responses relied on people's voluntary compliance until January 2021, when tougher restrictions were enacted. Under labels like freedom, sovereignty, and truth, protesters opposed the restrictions and rejected official explanations and established media sources. Selina Ortega Soto is a Cure team member at the Linköping University, researching cultures of rejection in Sweden as they relate to the COVID-19 pandemic.
In the protests against pandemic restrictions in Sweden, people from both right and left, often inspired by spiritual and conspiratorial myths, challenge the official explanations of this crisis. The melding of conspiracy theory and alternative spirituality is what Charlotte Ward and David Vose termed conspirituality. Although united under placards praising freedom, love, unity, and togetherness, many participants ultimately view political change as a question of individual consciousness or personal awakening. We have observed that these movements are caught in a noxious relationship to established media. Many of the diverse protesters reject traditional media sources and praise alternative and supposedly critical news outlets. As the demonstrations got bigger, new demonstrators revealed that it was the negative reporting itself that had inspired them to join the protests. This spiral, which further polarizes the political landscape, might make it necessary to move the conversation to different topics and ask different kind of questions.
Across Europe, conspiracy myths played a key role in protests against anti-pandemic measures. Many protesters portray themselves as awakened, in contrast to a supposedly slumbering general public. While the protests mobilized masses, a hyper-individualism characterizes most movements against the restriction of daily life and for freedom, sovereignty, and truth. But simply labeling protesters as conspiracy theorists only deepens the polarization observed in Sweden and elsewhere. We've seen how suspicions of collective organizing, skepticism towards democratic institutions, and a disenchantment with economic transformations predate the current crisis. It is on this level that we should think of cultures of rejection in the COVID-19 crisis and ask different questions to shift the political discussion. By engaging with these problems and by asking different questions, could we change the climate for different types of discussions? Our research into the working and living conditions across Europe highlights current elements of rejection in different local settings. Amongst the most obvious forms of rejection, we found racism, mainly against migrants and refugees. Here, the Cure research team's starting point was to challenge a popular story, a misrepresentation. Racism is not a natural reaction. It is a venue for social conflicts, a projection of grievances and resentments onto those people which are designated as strangers. Cultures of rejection target both powerful authorities and institutions, and social groups which are subject to exclusion and oppression, such as migrants and minorities. Our research in Croatia showed how this crisis and contradictions of a globalized, logistified capitalism creates local conditions in which such cultures of rejection thrive. And it also displayed how such negative effects are mediated and amplified on social media. In Germany, the Cure researchers encountered workers rejecting publicity online and offline. Under the pressure by time restraints and perceived pace of political developments, they retreat into walled and insular social circles. A disillusionment with political efficacy strengthens not only the rejections of politicians, but the cynical rejections of politics in its entirety. As we learned from researchers in Serbia, such anti-politics can paradoxically be mobilized by politicians themselves to strengthen authoritarian agendas. In Sweden, researchers focused on the rejection of scientific authorities and media in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. A mixture of conspiratorial and spiritual anti-establishment thinking shapes this aspect of cultures of rejection, a phenomenon that goes far beyond the case of Sweden. These societal developments are not natural reflexes that set in when work conditions transform and worsen, But right-wing political actors are working massively to give them political direction by reinforcing nationalist media narratives or historically racist discourse. But are they cultivated in daily life? Are they ordering daily experiences and practices? Have they become worldviews? What we're observing is that the belief in the political is evaporating, while the right tries to actively bypass old forms of politics. Yet they do not succeed in answering urgent questions of our times. So we ask, how do we invent and imagine new worldviews that are best suited for our times?
I see we have a vivid reaction from the back side, but thank you very much for watching this, and I would like to express once more my gratitude to Selina, Sara, Marco Luca, Benny and Alex, who were led by Manuela, who is a PI of this project and participated in production of this movie. Thank you once more. I think it came out great. Now I would like to invite our panelists for this discussion, which is following. We actually wanted to invite people who are not coming from academia. But when I'm thinking now, somehow all of them are researchers. They were researchers. They are, I think, when you are once researcher, you're always researcher. So I'm inviting him, Bojana Selaković, who is Program Director of Civic Initiatives, one of the largest and oldest, I would say, wherever you would like to sit, oldest civil society organizations, which has done a lot of work in supporting local initiatives, in supporting development of democratic culture in Serbia, and I would be really interesting to hear her evaluation of this short film. Then I would like to invite Georgette Reikovic. Here she comes. Đurđa is actually former colleague at the Institute. She was working when she returned from America at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, but she moved on. She's program director at the Reconstruction Women's Fund, which is working a lot and very extensively in supporting different kinds of initiatives dealing with gender and the sexual minorities. And finally, last but not the least, as they say, our colleague Srđan, yes, Đurović, who is coming from, actually, we met a long time ago as both researchers, young researchers back then at one project, and now he's working as program director at the Fund for Open Society here in Serbia. And I think this is very important because his job is actually to support all these local initiatives fighting against right wing. At some point, I think that was also very direct priority of the foundation here. Srđan, thanks a lot, and please, you can take whatever seat you would like. In the first round, my idea was actually to hear briefly your reflection on this, what you have heard, what we all have heard in this film. So we can start from Đurđa, let's say. So what is your impression? What is missing maybe here, or what struck you? Please tell us.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I think there is a lot of good news in this project. The good news is something that we've known all along and that we keep knowing, but we don't make a use of it, is that the working class or the people who are in oppressed situation or who are suffering directly from the state violence or nationalism are not by themselves racist, nationalists, etc. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the liberals, the left, the center has not captured that effect. And another bad news is that the right is doing a great job in capturing the affect. The one thing that I'm missing maybe is the funding. As the old saying goes, follow the money. If you look at the money situation and if you look at the funding of the right-wing organizations, you will understand why this is happening in Europe partly. Just to give you an illustration, I'm going to stop there to give others the opportunity. The anti-gender movement has 3 times more funding for their activities than the feminist movement, queer movements, minority movements. I think that explains a lot where we are here. And this is not only in Europe, this is in the whole world. So
we're going to come back to this. Bojana?
Okay, try it. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I have to say that my first impression was, oh my God, because for us, from this part of the world, all those things are, you know, very well known for the last 30 years. And during 90s here, when we were faced with very strong and dangerous authoritarian regime, we were able to see all those elements as a, you know, small pieces of one big puzzle. I became an activist during that period. And, you know, our main hope during 90s was that somewhere outside of Serbia there is a light. And we have to finish things with authoritarian regime and to become just a part of Europe and this wonderful big world, and everything will be fine. Unfortunately, now we can see that instead of, you know, Europeization of the Balkans, we can see the Balkanization of the rest of the world. And I'm so disappointed in that regard. And I have, I you know, became aware of this when, you know, some of my friends from US, you know, called me in the last few years and were, you know, so screamed, so disappointed, and also what we're gonna do now. We need a system. We have values. We need to protect our values. What is going on here? And you know, my first reaction was just laughing, because unfortunately we became more or less resilient on all those trends. And now we are able to talk maybe about some potential solutions, and I really hope that maybe now, from this perspective, we here from this part of the world can transfer some knowledges and know-how and practices in order to not repeat our mistakes. So that is my main impression. Thank you.
Thanks, Bojana. Srđan?
My main impression is actually, yeah, thank you for inviting us, because you were talking about the body politic reacting, like an allergic reaction to outsiders and intruders. And I hope this actually coming from not the body academic or academics, is not inviting those kinds of reactions in this specific community here. And I think that's actually one of the answers, in a sense, how to bridge different communities together in order to nurture the places of collective sense-making. As those places of collective sense-making, I think one of my impressions, and I think that's one of the messages I want to say, cannot be inside of a single community. The places of sense-making can be on the borders of meeting different communities, and there can actually specific practices can involve. Because from my experience of working on number of developing alternatives, is usually what we would create is a small echo chambers, a small pockets, air bubbles, which burst as soon as resources, as you've mentioned, disappear for supporting them. They were not transformative for further in widening the communities, and transformative for the members of those communities, which actually kind of engaged each other, because basically they were preaching to the converted. So that's one thing. Another, my impression is actually the style of this video, a small critique. What I didn't like is a bit of dystopian tone about it, and even the setting of a dystopian tone. And I think that's one of the points I would like to make as well. And that is, I'm a great fan of science fiction, and I've been reading science fiction since I'm, very little kid. And actually, my favorite SF show is one that most people call very ridiculous, and that is Star Trek. If you know the show, and it's basically very naive. It's a direct reflection of geopolitics at the time, and it's a direct reflection of very naive humanist thinking very often. And my favorite character, Jean-Luc Picard, Captain in the Next Generation season of the Star Trek, is one of those very, very kind of naive statement person, right? For example. At some point, they were in 23rd century, right? In 23rd century, the technological development that we are discussing, the transformation, technology and everything, actually reached us to the point where there is no money, right? So there is no money, but people still work. So he meets a person who is from the 20th century, and he asks him, well, why do people work if there is no money? There is no need to work to actually get the sustenance or anything else. And his answer is, for a betterment of humankind, of course. It's very naive, and I grant you that, but very often utopian thinking is naive. And what we have now is the opposite of that, is a completely dystopian thinking. And if you look at the SF production today, both in movies and culture and all those kinds of soft influences which we encounter in our everyday life, and which are actually a cultural reference points for our thinking about the world, they're all dystopian. They're all thinking the worst possible scenario of what a person, a man, a woman, or anyone can do, or what the worst things that the humanity is possible of doing, and projecting it to happen in terms of, violating a personal integrity, of destroying the planet, and so on and so on. And I think that kind of dystopian thinking in very progressive cultural circles is something I'm finding a big trouble with in this sense. Because if you look in this movie we saw, the right wing is actually talking about values, it's talking about institutions which we encounter in everyday life, immediate community, family, and so on and so forth. And they offer, even on a surface, a very, very humanist kind of discourse, unity, and I think that was mentioned, unity and, community values, our way of living, some kind of pride in what they are, and so on and so forth. And I think that one of the avenues to kind of go and look for these possible innovations, how we can unlock counterculture and how can unlock different narratives about our common life and kind of put it as a counter proposal against this, is actually to be a bit less dystopian in thinking and a bit more utopian in terms of our outlook towards the future and the capabilities of us to envisage life which is not going to be that we are going to fear people coming in, but we are going to welcome them and turn them into welcoming culture. And I think that reflects in a very political way as well, and I'll finish here, and that is, that builds the politics of distrust among. And for example, I'll give you an example from Serbia, recent political party which was formed, and they had this great idea to actually organize monitoring of the elections, right? So in order to organize the monitoring elections, they needed people, so they invited people openly on Facebook and said, come and join us to monitor the elections, right? The main reactions from the old political actors is, are you crazy? You're inviting people openly to join your ranks. That means you're going to have these all insiders from the ruling party and everything is going to... No, don't do that. But do you know any other alternative way to actually get people to monitor elections? No, we're just not going to be doing it. That kind of distrust is actually completely limiting us for political actions where I think it's an avenue for actually dealing with these things. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Srđan, for this inspiring intro. Well, yes, but when we are thinking about utopia and how we frame utopia, maybe we have some issue, and maybe this is something which is, Đurđa, you can continue. For example, I mean, it's impossible to discuss about cultures of rejection and everything what is happening without mentioning what happened 2 days ago, yeah, with Roe Wade in America, in United States. And when I'm thinking and when I'm reading what is the reaction, actually I cannot see, I have a feeling, that's just a feeling that we need something new as a narrative, as some new that we present as values, because I feel that this what we have and what we had within liberal democracy somehow spent. And how we move toward this direction, because I agree with you that we need some utopia in order to mobilize and build community. So what do you think, Đurđa?
Well, I kind of disagree with you a little bit. I think that utopia got us into this trouble. We were all very comfortable in believing in the institutions doing their job, that we have allies, that things are going to progress linearly, and they have not. And I think that for me personally, what has been a positive thing about the Roe versus Wade was the reaction from the progressives, feminists, and allies. And so the reaction, the way I read it, is something like this. We knew this was going to happen. We didn't have any illusions, and hold my beer. And I think that, to me, is a really honest and realistic approach to this. I have a hard time believing in utopia. I don't think it's necessary right now. And I think that the best thing we can say, perhaps one day we'll get here. But you do it because it's the right thing to do, and you don't want to live in this world. I don't want to live in the world of the right wing. I just don't want to live in that world. And this is why I think that I do the work that I do. I'm not comfortable, I cannot breathe, I cannot think, I cannot write, I cannot do anything. But to say that we need utopian thinking, I think that we haven't learned the mistakes of the past, because it got us there. Look at Latin America. They thought literally that they could implement utopia in the continent. I mean, the result is devastating. I don't think that necessarily we need a new thing. I think the new thing is part of the problem. I do think that what we need to do is organize, being more solidary, and being more coordinated. I was telling you before this that everybody's doing research. Everybody has their own hub. Everybody's doing their own thing. And when you look at it, what the right wing is doing, they don't. They're very organized. They're very structurally and formally ready to act in every situation. What we need to do is figure out the ways in which we can act and maintain heterogeneity. And I think this is the #1 task. It's not only about narrative, it's also convincing allies to ease the job, to ease the work. So in that sense, I think that we are doing a good job. I think that the feminist movement is really well connected, really well networked. The support that came from Latin America, which is the newest example of the success of the movement, is very strong. So I'm hopeful. I'm not pessimistic, but I don't think that utopia or utopian dystopian gets us. I don't think it's a discussion for us.
Popper would be very proud of you for the moment. Thank you, Đurđa. When you are mentioning this, especially about feminist movement, and when we are mentioning Roe Wade, and when we are mentioning the right wing and the anti-vaccine movement, actually, I was thinking when I was watching this film. At some point, there was a poster saying, "I decide what I enter into my body," and actually this is one of the main claims of the feminist movement, that my body is my body and I decide about whether I'm going to have a child or not. So there is somehow there is a connection between appropriation of the narratives of the embodiment, obviously, but also there is some kind maybe of taking what was your argument and using it for my own purpose when it comes to the right wing. So do you agree with me, and I'm now looking at Srđan, or you think that there is something specifically which we can use in order to organize ourselves and use it for making a community?
Sure, I'm going to answer that. I was completely focused on giving the response to this utopian.
Please feel free.
Yes. Because I think that
but briefly.
Very briefly. I understand the position, and I know where you're coming from in terms of utopian thinking, the critique of the enlightenment and everything, and linear. I'm not saying that utopian is the same way we envisaged it previously. In a sense, this is the place which is going to happen. The good future and everything is going to be good. But what you need to have a vision for mobilizing political masses. And that is what the right wing has. What we are not offering is a substantial, robust vision of everyday life, but also of the why would I not just give you my beer and say, hold my beer, how am I going to be activated to actually try to make a change in a specific social movement? Probably I've framed it very strongly saying utopian, dystopian, but I'm saying we need to have a mobilizing narrative and provide for people spaces and allow them to actually mobilize. In a response to your question, in a sense, I think one, and I'm not sure if that answers the question, you remember the famous formula in the workers, in the labor rights movements, 888, which is 8 hours work, 8 hours sleep, and 8 hours recreation. I think what is missing there in this specific context, and I think in democracy as a political kind of, is where is the space for actually doing something, engaging? We are always asking people to participate in things. Where is the time and space for them to participate? If we look at the activists, and I've been working in the civil society sector pretty much as long as you have, I think, Anna, which is over 20 years, is now we almost exclusively organizers are people who do that professionally, because people do not have time, don't have resources to engage, which makes it even a lot harder to kind of, further mobilize or make any substantial change on the grounds regarding any specific thing. And I think there is this kind of silence about the fact, are people actually able to engage, even though we always call them engage, be a citizen, take care of this, take care of that, think about this, think about that, and so on. This issue is important, that issue is important. When and what time? In an increasingly complex situation, in precarious position and so on, the space for political organization, mobilization, debate is almost non-existent. And it's very hard really to go into a factory and tell a worker, yeah, engage with the unions which didn't do anything for last 20 years. Why would she or her actually do that?
Okay, but when they do engage, and we have some waves of engagement even in our region, they engage actually around some issues which we would name green issues, let's say ecological issues. We had, for example, here protests against Rio Tinto, for example, and they are very frequently captured by the right wing. And for example, when we had this, and also we don't know if those protests, we know some of them, but we don't know if raising them on national level is self-organized, it's bottom-up, or there is some agenda which is coming and which is actually belonging to this 3 times more money invested in the organization of right wing than in our parts of the spectrum, let's say. So, Bojana, what do you think about this? You have a lot of experience with this.
Yeah, maybe just a small reflection on what colleagues said. So I fully agree with Đurđa, and for Srđan, maybe definitely actually I think that we have to be focused on the trust that was also mentioned here in this movie. And we have to reconsider our own accountability. We have to reconsider, who are our people when we are talking about, a kind of activistic elitism, which is definitely visible here, and that is also a global trend. But if we are able to provide a trust, then we are on a good way. And one way to do that is to be more solidar, to exit from our own bubbles, because there is a strong intention among ourselves here, among academic researchers, among activists, politicians, to be focused exclusively on their own bubbles. And I think that's a catch. And in that regard, you know, if we are talking about some values and if we are wanting to protect certain values, then we have an infrastructure. I think that existing of strong infrastructure is that core difference between us and these right-wing groups. So now I will continue with your question, but very connected with what I said. I think that environmental mobilization here in Serbia is a very good example for that. So me personally, I'm engaged for the last 5 years, and I worked with so many different local activistic groups gathered about very concrete local issues, mostly related to environmental issues. My organization is not dealing with environmental protection. We do not have that kind of expertise. We are focused on mobilization of citizens and, you know, help them to strengthen them, to be more visible and with more influence. And I have to say that in 90% of cases, we were for the first time, you know, faster, and in most of cases, the only actor outside of those communities who visited them, asked them what you need, what are your problems, how we can support you, how we can help you, etc., etc. Beside us, only different right-wing groups here from Belgrade, mostly connected with right-wing political parties, were there on the ground. And that was, you know, fight among us who will be faster. And when you come to the people who are, you know, not familiar with your previous work and, you know, are consumers of those narratives, in this case, you know, narrative about civil society organizations from Belgrade who are, you know, foreign missionaries, who are spies, that is also part of those narratives here. And with the lack of trust. And if you help them and support them in a way that they need, then everything is easier. After that, we had situation, and my personal experience, especially during last year, is that we worked directly with some people who were members of those parties, of those groups, who said, so okay, you are doing good things, so no matter if you are receiving funds from the abroad. So everything is connected with the trust. And if we are able to provide that and to think in that way, then we can be more efficient in that approach. And the second important issue is related again with, you know, who are our target groups? Only people who are already on our side, or we want to work with the people from another part of the spectrum. I think that is right way, and as we could see, you know, neither racism, nationalism, or any other bad feeling is not natural. All those people, from my perspective, especially after those few years, says that you know, it's a just construction and people are consumers like they are consuming some other contents from the media, from, I don't know, some other parts of the society. So in that regard, this massive environmental uprising here in Serbia was a combination of all those elements that you mentioned. But definitely some of right-wing groups were there, but they were not, you know, so visible. They were not, you know, leaders of the movement. the real leaders of the movement were targeted people. You know, just ordinary people from different local communities, where, you know, some mining activities were planned, and you know, people which were, you know, with so bad feelings about their future, their lives, their houses, etc., etc. And I think that was the key momentum of those protesting activities here in Serbia. So in that regard, I think that the most important lessons are that we have to be, you know, aware that we need infrastructure and that we are that kind of infrastructure. But people must be, you know, in the first lines, and to not be afraid to contact people, you know, who are sharing some of different values from us, and there is, I think, definitely strong space in which we can talk to them and to explain them why they are not at the right place in the society in terms of those values.
Thank you, Bojana. When you're saying we, I'm thinking actually how this we is shrinking, and how this other, I mean, I'm now using this term, but this other, which is for the moment, as we discussed, right-wing movement is expanding. And we can see that, for example, we are not exceptional here in Serbia. I mean, we are part of the much larger movement. We have, for example, we have parties which is not even like a ruling party, oppositional party, or claim to be oppositional party, that is going to the conference of other parties in Europe, and the name of the conference is God, Homeland and Family, for example. Or we can see that some members of our intellectual community, but also of political community, is meeting with, for example, Steve Bannon here in Belgrade, or etc. So we are definitely, I would say that we are part of the larger global movement, and mining this, and also mining this, what you, Đurđa, just said, that there is a lot of money which is invested. I'm thinking two things, and I would like the reflection of all of you, and I think this would be like a closing thing. Whether this is, let's say, North American European thing that we are facing, because we have connections between North America and our right wing in Europe. In Europe, when I say ours. We in Serbia also have connections with Russian right wing, not to forget this and not to neglect this, but what is actually shaping our scene, and this is one thing. And another thing, if we know all this, and if we know how much they are stronger for the moment, how can we, what instruments we have at our disposal to connect with each other, and to go actually to those who you say their leaders are coming from very local community, or there are those activists, you know, in the field, but we need a lot of energy, a lot of people to get them all. And right-wing ideology is obviously something which is, I wouldn't say definitely not natural. I agree with what is said, but it's something which we are raised in, and somehow majority of the people may be adopted through this socialization process, and now we have to reverse this, and how to reverse it when actually they are for the moment stronger. So it's a little bit of everything, but I hope that you get when I'm going to. So Đurđa.
I mean, it's a difficult question. I don't know if I have the answer, but I think that I understand where directions, right? So I'll just give you the numbers because it's very interesting. So there was a research study that was just published by European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. From 2009 to 2018, they traced $700 million where they came from and where they went to. So all of these $700 million went to the right wing. 11% came from the United States, 26% came from Russia, and 61% came from the European-grown right-wing organizations. Now, I think that the first step is everybody knows about Soros and Bill Gates Foundation. How many people here know about Koch Foundation? Their net worth is the same as Bill Gates. The Koch brothers and the Federalist Society, which is something that Antonin Scalia funded back in the day, are the main funders of anti-gender movements. But everybody's talking about foreign mercenaries on the liberal left, but nobody's talking about them. So we are losing the propaganda wars because the liberals and left don't like the word propaganda. That's one thing. The second thing is infrastructure. You have to build it. I mean, all of these foundations have their offices in Europe that are very active and that are very in connection with Russian oligarchs and American oligarchs and all over the world. I think that the situation is a little bit different in Latin America and in China, which is an opening market for philanthropic support, mainly because they do not allow foreign donations in their countries, and now what you have is are billionaires that are families. So you have to convince them to fund the liberal leftist movement. I think that's tricky, but it's a field. It's a space of action for us to do, and I think that and this goes back to naivety. I think this is why it's dangerous. If you go to public, and I think this is just the perception of an ordinary viewer, when you listen to right-wing people, they all have the same story with the very storytelling and personal narratives that describe their experiences. All of us, we go to the public, we are fearful, we are freaking out, we cannot say the wrong words, we disavowed multiculturalism, we disavowed cosmopolitanism, and if we go with climate change, we say, well, it's the end of the world, another extinction is coming. So I think that a lot of it is about narrative that has kind of shifted or disappeared from the public sphere. And then I think that the main thing is that all of this funding and the right wing has supporters, but we haven't done the research to map who are the right wing supporters because they are heterogeneous as well. If you voted for Orban, that does not mean that you're racist. There is something there that you have to distinguish and then convince them that he's your ally and not Orban's to vote for you or to work with you. And I think that, you know, the left or the liberals is always in crisis, but I think, you know, these are the very concrete steps that I'm seeing happening in the field.
Thank you. Buena, what do you think?
Agree, definitely, and I have to say that also what we did, and that was definitely a wrong way, is that we just led them to capture all narratives. So now, if you are, you know, saying that you are a feminist, that directly means that you are, you know, against family as such, against, you know, protection of working parents, working mothers, against some direct state government incentives in area of social protection, child protection, etc., etc. So similarly is with the narratives about war crimes and wars in general here in the Balkans. So if you are saying there was a genocide in Srebrenica, that directly means that you think that there were no victims among Serbian people during the war. So we didn't tackle numerous topics, and they just used that space and then to make a kind of a real confusion and to incorporate it into their narratives. So in that regard, what we did and what we saw that works is, just, a kind of freedom to go and to go inside to their narratives. So especially among the topics that are tackling all of us on a daily basis, about families, about children, and to prove that there is no any kind of polarization of discrepancy if we are talking about women's rights as such and some other topics. So that is what we had here, and that was very carefully planned, I think, with so many investments in media, social media, etc., etc. So Russian funds, and especially in this part relevant for families and children, funds that are coming from Hungary directly, but in completely different ways than, for example, support and funds from the Western foundations, European Union, etc., etc. So they're paying by cash. No complicated procedures, no submitting projects, writing reports, etc., etc. People on another spectrum are facing, with very complicated procedures, administrative bureaucracy. All those funds are transparent. No any official data about, support in that illiberal part of civil society from Russia. But we all know that, funds are coming. So maybe those lessons are also very important, and our main suggestion to donors here and in the region is to be more flexible, to create approaches and mechanisms that will be, very fast, and that will provide a real and effective response when people need it. So I think that situation is not so sad, so black. We demonstrated that there is a space, and what we have to do now and in the future definitely is more uniting, more joint actions, more solidarity, but not just on ad hoc basis, but real joining forces to provide a real and effective infrastructure that will demonstrate a kind of trust what is needed.
Thanks a lot, Bojana. Srđan?
I'm not sure what the question actually was.
What instruments do we have to fight this?
I think one of the instruments that's like instruments tools, different. It's always people in my experience. For example, the last strategy we were writing, the Open Society Foundation, I think one of the main lines I was introducing there is we need to invest in people. So you need to invest in specific actors, you invest in people, you do not invest in very specific short-term outcomes of something. The right wing has a very clear strategy. It's fighting a cultural war. A cultural war does not look at the immediate impact, it looks at the end result. It looks at the utopian vision of their own society. On the other hand, what we've turned the civil society into very much is not, the Gramscian concept of fighting, in the cultural trenches and, winning institution at the time and kind of creating the new hegemony, which is going to be in a different value orientation. We look in this impact and these effects and these measurements and these kinds of things. If we are talking about the trust, and I completely agree, we need to forge a new trust among the social actors which are engaged in what is now taking form, and everyone is, well, it seems they want to see it as a struggle between the right and the liberal progressive left. apparently we cannot have a common denominator for everyone else against the right. So investment in people which in a longer term can actually give them space and time to come up with the solutions which might not be immediately there. I think that's one in terms of instruments. And another orientation is I see all these things are actually depoliticization, and I think that point is very important. And if you look at what is actually happening is, you know, we have alienated people from the political process because we've reduced them to voting once every 4 years, and then we have these huge campaigns, and after that, you know, we don't care about them. That's something that's been mentioned, that it is at the crux of this. But also, they are starting to alienate themselves from the political process as well, claiming not to be political, even when they are actually political par excellence, very political in its essence. And I think the same, what we need to look at, how do we have these small initiatives, which we talk, it's only about, you know, lives of people here, but all those acts are political, and there needs to be actors which recognize ways in which these small struggles on local level are political, and try to scale them up, try to build a narrative from these small specific examples, because they are very political. For example, a very old institution from the socialist regime called local community or mesna zajednica is revived in an ecological struggle against the mini hydroplants, which was one of the mobilizing ecological factors. You see there that was a very political statement. We want an institution which is a political institution which we want to use for our own struggle, not to have something blocking our river, and we are going to use it. We are going to reinvent it. We are going to infuse it with life, a new meaning, and new discourses, and use it as an infrastructure to actually put up a fight. And that fight was a small victory, and celebrate those small victories. That's the final kind of...
Sorry, if I may just...
I agree with you. I don't know, can you hear me? I'm not, okay. I agree with you, but I think we also have to be self-reflective of what we represent. Private foundations cannot do that work. And I think that when we talk about trust and private foundations, there is something very cynical about it. What would happen if we said, I'm going to betray you, will you go to the battle with me? And if that would be the start of something else, again, I think the naivety, the trust, there isn't trust. The foundations are getting stricter and stricter. The flexibility that we are advocating is not happening. It's project-based. It's not movement-based. There are very few that are doing that in the region or in the world. But if you say, I'm going to betray you, but let's do this fight together, maybe that would be a different foundation and a different start. The second part is local initiative, yes. But back in the day, they were part of institutions. They were not funded by private funders and private donors. The question is, how do you get back into these institutions and have your voices heard? And I think this is the topic. How do you make them listen? And there have been some very successful stories, very successful initiatives, but they're usually a long-term, hard-working field work that many people don't want to do unless they're very passionate about the cause or the politics that they want to represent. So I think we have to be kind of honest about the limits and possibilities there.
Yeah, just to add that environmental topics are very good, you know, examples for what you said, because, you know, those problems are tackling all of us, you know, no matter if we are, you know, left or right, or men or woman, etc., and definitely, you know, provide a space for creating that kind of trust. In terms of supporting and helping and some structured mobilization, fully agree about what you said, and from our own experience, the most important lessons are related to the flexibility of the donors when they were ready to exclude some activities or grants from the visibility rules. And definitely, I think that is something what should be regular practice in very sensitive cases. So you can talk with the people about, you know, definitely about funders and about from where the funds are coming, but that kind of, you know, very strong visibility that was an intention here. From, I don't know, US, European Union, and among their other activities here with the government as well, definitely is not helping in this process. So more flexibility, more flexibility, more flexibility. That is my final
Yes,
statement.
I just want to reflect briefly on what you said, private versus public. I think we made through a long process of going from public to private, because as you all remember, at least people who are living in Serbia, that we look at nostalgia in the countries, on the countries whose citizens don't know anything about politics and don't know who is president, who is prime minister. We say this is the country where people are living good life. So, but this also brings a danger, obviously, because in those type of countries, then we have pushback, and we have somehow we moved from institutions which are public, we moved them and we let them. We let the private institutions or private bodies to do the politics actually in those terms. I have just one very brief question for three of you. Can you answer me just one sentence? Is there anything specific, because we have here guests from throughout Europe, is there anything specific in one sentence about Serbian right wing? Anything when you think on the scene, is there anything which is here which you cannot find somewhere else?
They have a left-wing social policy. They have a left-wing social agenda. If you look at Zavetnici and their social program, it's like, oh wow, this is really great. So the social policy around it is interesting.
What do you think? Agree? Don't agree?
Nothing really. No, actually, no. I think nothing very specific which I would think of now that is very because I think, for example, some of the left wing, if you look at populist movements in Latin America, they also had historically back there had social policy and so on. But it is, I think, what is specific is actually the authoritarian. I mean, the authoritarian hybrid regime and the way it plays with the far right on a discursive level, and I think that happens on other places as well. But he's a little bit more kind of, yeah, even
visible,
stronger.
More visible,
yeah. Here in Serbia, more than in another country, they have very strong previous bases and legacy from the previous decades. So unfortunately, in our society, we had this kind of discussions, you know, very soon after the Second World War and during 1948, when, you know, that kind of polarization between US and Russia definitely based on our internal society issues. And definitely they are still using those narratives because we didn't and we missed opportunity to solve those internal issues and to make a kind of, you know, joint collective awareness and knowledge about some historical facts.
Well, thank you very much for this discussion. I want to ask the floor if there are any questions for our panelists. Yeah?
As usual, yeah.
Usual suspects, okay.
Thank you. Just a brief comment. Thank you all. I feel like there is a certain higher and broader understanding of the right wing and what's going on. I just want to make a very brief point. At some moments, it looked like you are ready to recognize, you know, the superiority of the right wing today. And I'm telling you how it sounded from the audience. And I don't want this event to end in that sense. You know, they don't have a better story okay? They don't have a better knowledge of the situation. Maybe, just as Georgia said, they are doing slightly better at the moment in terms of discipline and organization, you know? So why they capture the hearts and minds of common people easily than the left wing, that's a genuine question. But I don't want this, socialism had a brilliant understanding of capitalism that when you read some authors, it looks like that they really think that capitalism is, unfallible. It's so solid that it cannot be. Or in the mid to late 30s, some understanding and movies about Nazis, they really like, oh, these guys, they're really strong, they are really powerful, disciplined and everything. So that's why strategically I don't think we should, give right wing too much, It's just, that would be my point. Take this away from me.
Okay. This was a comment. Is there any other further comment, reaction? Well, if not, yeah, please.
Work off of that, because we were having these discussions, like you were saying, like the left is not doing that poorly. Like institutionally, it's fine, human rights are there. Yes, there is a backlash, but there is no panic or... And then I said, the thing about them being loud right now and very articulate in the public, there is a lot of anger and rage that has been captured. I mean, Trump did that marvelously, like amazingly. Is that, have you ever met a happy nationalist? Like, they don't laugh. You know what I mean? And I think, and I know it sounds silly and stupid, but I think that if you go back to the public perception, somebody who doesn't have time, who works 8, like you look at these angry people and you're like, oh wow, we live really in dark times because the queers and the feminists are going to take away the land and whatever. And I think that's what we have failed to capture for some reason.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Đurđa, Srđan, Bojana, for taking part in this event. We are continuing tomorrow with the conference. I would just briefly tell you what we are going to have. So tomorrow, after introducing the culture of rejection and what we meant when we started this project, we are going to discuss about migration and borders after 2015 with two things. One is presentation by P.O. Hansen, who is coming from Sweden, Linköping University, who is going to tell us a little bit more about macroeconomics of migration, right? And why refugees are not fiscal burden. And then we are going to have round table with regional representatives of academia coming from Slovenia and Serbia, chaired by Bernd Kasparek from Humboldt. 7 years later, old roots and new patterns of contested mobility in Southeastern Europe. After that, after lunch, we are continuing with the conjunctures of right-wing politics, where we are going to online presentation by Nitsan Soshan from University of Mexico, telling us a little bit about populism and political immediacy in Germany and beyond, and Matthew McManus from University of Calgary, who will tell us a little bit more of where does postmodern conservatism fit within the reactionary tradition. And on Wednesday, we are going to have a discussion about about the word which we have heard a lot this evening, about infrastructures of rejection. And we're going to have two presentations by Fabio Mattioli, or just to confirm, yeah, we're labor of trolling, grand platforms and fake news, so about digital cultures of rejection, and then COVID-19 and geographies far right in Germany, which is presentation by Daniel Mullis and Paul Schocke, if I'm pronouncing it well, thank you, coming from Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. And finally, we are going to have a round table with our own representatives of our team of Project Cultural Rejection in Europe, which you mostly all met here during the film. Just you didn't meet Milan Urošević, who is coming from our institute, and Manuel Libik, who is coming from Vienna. And finally, the final session will be Cultures Against Rejection. We are going to have Nasira Gwenif. I'm not good in pronouncing. She's going to tell us a little bit more about rejecting rejection, shifting embodiments, and shaping alliances. And she's coming from University Paris 8 in France. So this is what we prepared for the next 2 days, and I hope to see you all there, and also other people which we invited focusing on these topics. Now I invite you all to join in cocktail, and we are going to have very promptly served. We promised we are going to finish by 8, but we are 10 minutes early, the cocktail and food. So please enjoy this evening with drinks, and see you soon tomorrow.